6 weeks before her death, Clara didn't seek help, she built a case. While everyone else believed she was a victim, she was quietly assembling evidence, planning a legal strike that would unfold after she was gone. This is not just a story of loss. This is a masterclass in foresight, strategy, and how the truth, when timed right, can dismount everything.
The hospital made 11 calls to him. They tried for 3 solid hours. But her husband didn't answer. His wife was on a hospital gurney, her own life and the lives of their twin babies hanging in the balance. A nurse repeated his name into the phone, trying the number over and over. 7 miles from the hospital, his phone sat on a table in his luxury apartment, face down and silent. He was enjoying a dinner with candlelight and wine. Another woman smiled at him and urged him to eat. They all believed Clara had 3 more weeks of her pregnancy. But she only had 47 minutes left on this earth. When Clara Whitfield drew her last breath in that cold, sterile room, she was not beaten. She passed on with the calm certainty of a plan that was already in motion. 6 weeks prior, she had made a secret trip to see a lawyer. She was not there to ask for help. She was there to build a fortress for her unborn children. It was all for a day in court, where 4 words from a doctor would ruin the woman who would dare to smile at her funeral. You must hear this story. Clara's legacy is not just a tale of heartbreak. It is a story about the amazing power a woman can build in silence when others underestimate her. This will change how you see everything that comes next. Let me be very clear about the lesson. The greatest power a woman possesses is not in hoping for a rescue. It is the power to prepare quietly for the moment when she can tell the truth on her own terms. If you have ever loved someone who did not deserve your heart, this story is for you. If you have ever worked in secret toward a personal goal, you will understand this. Please, share this story with anyone who needs a reminder of their own hidden power. If you are ready to see this through, go ahead and press the like button. In the comments below, tell us if you have known a woman with Clara's kind of quiet strength. For our new viewers, we invite you to subscribe and turn on your notifications. We tell stories like this one every single week. These are stories of women who learn to be their own heroes. Now, let us begin. The heart monitor beeped twice. Then its entire rhythm shifted. It was not a loud, sudden alarm, just a small change. It was like the air growing still just before a big storm. Lying there in her hospital bed, Clara Whitfield felt the change in her body before her mind understood it. She put a hand on her pregnant belly as a contraction came over her. When it finally ended, she fell back against her pillow and picked up her phone. She had already tried to call Edmund 4 times. Every call went right to his voicemail. She never even heard a single ring, only a recorded voice asking for a message. She did not leave any messages. Instead, she just kept locking and unlocking her phone's screen. She would put it down, then immediately pick it back up to look at the time. It was 3:47 in the afternoon. She had been in the hospital for 2 hours and 14 minutes. The pain started around noon, and it was gentle at first, just as the books had described. By 2 o'clock, the contractions were getting very strong. By 3:15, she could not ignore them. And she had called her friend Janine first. That was the one detail that said everything. She had called Janine before she called Edmund. The order of those calls told a story she was not yet willing to admit. Janine Crawford was at home when she got the call from Clara. Before Clara even finished her sentence, Janine had her coat on and her keys in her hand. That was the type of friend she was. In 14 years of friendship, Janine had always shown up. Now, she stood with her back to Clara, staring out the hospital window with her arms crossed. She watched the cars on the street below, holding herself perfectly still, like a person trying to keep a powerful emotion inside. He knew it could be any time now, Clara said in a low voice. I know, Janine said back. His meeting was done at noon. That was almost 4 hours ago. Janine finally turned to face her. Her expression was carefully blank, hiding what she truly felt. She came over and took the seat by the bed, holding Clara's hand in her own. The doctor will be here in a minute, Janine said quietly. Let's just focus on that. The room had the sharp, clean smell of a hospital, but also the sweet fragrance of freesia. A small vase with white flowers was on the windowsill. Clara had once mentioned they were her favorite flower. The nurses had remembered that little fact. Clara had a way of noticing small kindnesses. It was the big displays of love that seemed to be missing from her world. Just then, a nurse named Addie Carr came in. She was carrying a blood pressure monitor and had an aura of complete control, as if she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "on a scale from 1 to 10, how bad is your pain?" "A 7, Clara told her, "or maybe a 7.5. "And how often are the contractions?" the nurse asked. "Every 3 minutes, sometimes even closer." Addie expertly wrapped the cuff around Clara's arm and watched the numbers climb. Her face stayed calm, but her eyes became sharp and focused. "I am calling Dr. Saw right now," Addie said firmly. "Is there a problem?" Clara asked, her voice filled with worry. "I just want the doctor to check on you, just to be safe." Addie was at the door when she paused and glanced back. "Is your husband on his way?" Clara's gaze drifted to the silent phone on her bed. She looked at it the way you look at something that has let you down for the very last time. "I have been trying to reach him," she said softly. The nurse looked at her, and for a moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Then she gave a small nod and left the room. Janine just squeezed Clara's hand tighter, because some things don't require words. At Janine's insistence, the hospital coordinator dialed Edmund's office number. A new assistant answered the call. There was a weird hesitation, just 4 seconds too long. Then the assistant said in a flat, robotic voice, "Mr. Whitfield is currently unavailable." There it was again. Currently unavailable. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. She was 37 weeks pregnant with twins. She had picked out the pale green paint for the nursery all by herself. She had wanted a color that would be perfect for a boy or a girl. She thought about an afternoon spent folding tiny baby outfits while gentle music played in the other room. She would read stories to her belly and feel her babies kick when they heard her voice. She had done every single thing an expecting mother should do. And she had done it all completely on her own. Edmund was always on a work trip or in a meeting, or to use his assistant's words, currently unavailable. She opened her eyes and looked right at Janine. "Okay," she said, her voice suddenly strong. "Let's focus." The next painful wave came only 2 minutes and 40 seconds later. Clara held on to the metal bed rail and breathed through the pain. She told herself that she could get through this. She had gotten through everything else alone. 4 minutes later, Addie was back with the doctor. Dr. Patricia Saw came into the room behind her. The doctor was 52, with short hair streaked with gray. After delivering babies for 3 decades, she knew that staying calm was not a feeling. It was a choice she made to help her patients. She quietly looked at the numbers on the monitor. She put her hands on Clara's stomach, her expert fingers reading the position of the babies. It was a skill that came from thousands of deliveries. After 3 quick questions, she looked straight into Clara's eyes. "I need to tell you what is happening." Clara held her gaze and said, "Tell me everything." The doctor said, "One of the babies has shifted position since we last checked. At the same time, your blood pressure is high and it is climbing. Because of these 2 issues, we need to move to a surgical suite right now." "Is this just in case?" Clara asked. "No," Dr. Saw said with a gentle voice. "It is because it is necessary. We have to be in a place where we can act very quickly if the situation changes," the doctor continued. Clara just gave a slight nod. Nurse Addie looked at her and saw a strange kind of peace. It was not the peace of a woman who was not afraid. It was the peace of a woman who had been afraid for a very long time and had made her preparations. "Please, can you try calling my husband one last time?" Clara asked. The coordinator placed the call, but it went to his voicemail once again. Clara then reached for her own phone. She found Edmund's name in her contacts and just stared at it, her thumb hanging in the air above the screen. After a second, she put the phone back on the bed, with the screen down. She never picked it up again. That was the exact moment her heart truly gave out. It was not the doctor's news that hurt the most. It was her own decision to stop trying. It was the final quiet acceptance that she was by herself, just as she had suspected all along. Clara had known this moment would arrive for a very long time. The hospital workers moved her bed quickly down the hallway. Above her, the white ceiling panels passed by one. She counted the bright lights as she went. Addie, the nurse, walked right next to her. Her hand rested gently on the metal side of the bed, a comforting touch that was not required. This was not part of her duties. It was not written in any rule book. She did it because Clara Whitfield's eyes were silently begging, saying, "I am so scared, and I just need someone to be with me." So, Addie walked with her. The sweet floral scent from her room faded as they went down the long corridor. The strong smell of disinfectant grew much stronger. The doors of the operating room swung open, showing a room that was cold, white, and waiting. Monitors were all set up, and 3 nurses in blue scrubs moved around with quiet skill. Dr. Sa stood at the far end of the table, looking at Clara from over the top of her surgical mask. "Everything will be all right," the doctor promised. Clara just stared back. Her blood pressure was dangerously high at 162/104. Her hands rested calmly on the table. "Please take care of the babies first," Clara whispered. "No matter what else happens, save them." Dr. Sa held her gaze for a long moment. "I understand," she said. A monitor's steady beep suddenly changed its tune. Dr. Sa looked at the screen, then at her nurse, Addie. They exchanged a look that needed no words. They were a team that understood each other perfectly. Then, they sprang into action. The bright lights on the ceiling began to blur for Clara. She felt a cold fluid enter her arm through the intravenous line. The room slowly started to spin as the medication began to work. Her last thoughts were about the flowers sitting on her hospital room windowsill. She pictured the small plant she had placed in the nursery back home. She remembered reading that a plant can make a room feel more welcoming. She hoped someone would think to water it. Then a final clear thought formed. "I am done waiting for him. I have decided that when this is over, I will not wait for him ever again." But the thought was never completed. Her world faded to a quiet, empty white. 7 miles from Mercy Summit Hospital, on the 43rd floor of the Whitfield Towers, the candles were glowing. They were made from expensive, pure beeswax. Veronica Hale had them ordered from a special shop. She also selected the wine, a rare bottle from France that cost more than a family's weekly groceries. She had placed white flowers in a low crystal bowl on the dining table. This was carefully planned, so they would not obstruct the beautiful city view from the giant windows. She arranged every detail because she understood Edmund Whitfield perfectly. For 14 months, she had studied him like a scientist observing a unique creature. She knew his attraction to beauty was a basic instinct, like a compass always pointing north. Because he was always drawn to beautiful things, she worked constantly to make herself the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Edmund sat at the table, with his jacket off and his tie loosened. His phone was on a table in the hall, placed face down just as Veronica had suggested. "Just 2 hours," she had said, taking it from him with a practiced smile. "Everything is handled. Your assistant knows where you are." She then added, "Clara is not due for another 3 weeks." He handed over the phone because it was simply easier than arguing with her. For the last 2 years, Edmund Whitfield had consistently chosen the path of least resistance. These small decisions had piled up, building a life he had never actively chosen, but had also never tried to escape. He looked down into the red wine swirling in his glass. He glanced at the perfect white flowers in the fancy bowl. He looked up at Veronica, who was watching his every move. "You seem distracted tonight," she observed. "Clara's due date is in 3 weeks," he replied quietly. "There is always some drama with her," Veronica said with a dismissive wave of her hand. She made other people's problems sound so unimportant. She leaned over and refilled his wine glass. "Just eat your dinner," she told him. And so, he ate his dinner. That was the most important thing to know about Edmund Whitfield. He was not an intentionally cruel person. Cruelty requires energy, and Edmund's greatest weakness was his lack of effort. He had just told himself convenient lies for years, and those lies had stacked up like unpaid bills. He promised himself he would end things with Veronica after the babies arrived. He convinced himself that Clara would never discover his secret. He believed that providing money for things, like a private hospital room and the best doctors, was the same as showing love. He thought this financial support was enough to hold everything together, long after the real affection had disappeared. He was completely mistaken about every single one of those things. And in a secret part of his heart that he always ignored, he knew the truth. He had known it for a very, very long time. Across the table, Veronica studied him. She was 31 years old and never let emotions get in the way of her goals. Her father, Thomas Hale, had raised her to be a beautiful and valuable possession. Her entire life, She had been paraded at events where powerful men conducted business. She had come to terms with this role a long time ago. The only alternative was a life with less money, with cheaper wine, and with zero influence. She understood her job perfectly. She also understood, with a hidden coldness, that Clara's pregnancy was a game changer. Having twins meant there would be 2 legal heirs. The official documents had already been changed and filed. 2 newborn children now had a legal right to everything Edmund Whitfield owned. She looked over Edmund's shoulder at the glittering city lights outside. She stared at the view like a person calculating the value of land they intended to buy. In the hallway, Edmund's phone rested on a small table. Its screen flashed on once, then a second time, and then a third. A faint blue light pulsed against the dark wall. It was like a very soft knock on a door from a world away. But Edmund never heard it. Soft Italian music filled the apartment. The candlelight flickered warmly. The wine was delicious. The phone screen continued to light up, again and again. 7 miles away, the operating room doors were sealed shut. In the hospital corridor, Janine Crawford could not stay still. She paced nervously up and down the empty hall. Pacing was how she dealt with situations that were too big for her brain to handle. She walked to the end of the corridor and then walked back. She paused by a water fountain but did not get a drink. She tried calling Edmund's cell phone, but it went straight to his voicemail, so she hung up. She called his assistant, Philip, who said to Mr. Whitfield had left the office that afternoon. She tried Dale Whitfield, Edmund's brother, but he did not answer either. At last, she stopped pacing. She just stood alone in the hallway, under the bright, sterile lights, breathing in the smell of antiseptic. From far down the hall, she heard the happy cry of a newborn baby from another family. She took out her own phone and looked at her recent calls. She saw the list clearly. 11 calls to Edmund's number. Every single call had a time next to it. Every single call was marked unanswered. The call log was evidence of her efforts. She took a photograph of her phone's screen. Then she took a second one. At the time, she was not sure why she did it. She just had to do something with her shaking hands. Over the last hour, her worry turned into something hard and cold. She would later understand it was preparation. And she was a woman who was always prepared. Clara had always admired that quality in her. She had depended on it. Janine emailed the screenshots to herself to keep them safe. Then, she made one more call. This time, she dialed the number for Ruth Whitfield, Edmund's mother. Ruth answered the phone on the second ring, which was highly unusual for her. "Ruth," Janine said, her voice steady, "Clara is in an emergency surgery. I am unable to reach Edmund. I felt you would want to know." There was a pause that lasted for exactly 4 seconds. It was not a pause of surprise. It was the sound of a 71-year-old woman carefully considering the facts. "What is the hospital's name?" Ruth asked. "Mercy Summit. Use the private entrance on the north side. I will be there in 20 minutes. Ruth ended the call. Janine stood alone in the quiet hallway, still holding her phone. She stared at the large double doors at the far end of the hall. They were the doors to the surgical area. They were shut tight, and she knew they would not open until everything was finished. She finally found a plastic chair by the wall, sat down, and prepared to wait. Inside the operating room, things were happening fast. The first twin, a boy, was born at 5:41 in the afternoon. He weighed 6 pounds and 2 ounces. His strong cry filled the entire room, a loud and furious complaint about his sudden arrival into the world. Addie wrote down the time and saw the intense concentration in Dr. Saren's eyes. That was one baby delivered, with one more still to go. The second birth is often the most difficult. The second twin, a little girl, had moved into a dangerous position during the delivery. Dr. Saren worked with a calm, focused energy, pushing her own emotions aside for later. "Pressure," she commanded. "I need more pressure. Let's go. Come on." There, the girl was born at 5:46. She weighed just 4 pounds and 11 ounces. At first, she made no sound. For 3 long seconds that felt like an eternity, the whole room held its breath. Then, she let out a tiny but determined cry, as if to announce her arrival. Addie felt a wave of relief. Both of the babies were breathing. But Clara was not. The heart monitor showed a flat line at 5:53 in the afternoon. Dr. Saren announced the official time of death. Her professional words felt like a heavy door slamming shut forever. She stood completely still for 3 slow breaths. This was her personal ritual. She would stand for a moment and allow the weight of the loss to settle. Then she turned to her team. There was still more that needed to be done. There was always more work to be done. Out in the hallway, Janine looked up and saw Addie coming through the doors. She understood the terrible news before a single word was spoken. She could see it in the way Addie walked, in the look on her face, and in the way she sat down and gently took both of Janine's hands. She just knew. She sat with that awful truth for a quiet moment. Then she finally asked, "What about the babies?" "They are both alive," Addie answered softly. "Both are breathing." "It is a boy and a girl," Janine nodded her head. She continued to nod for a little longer than necessary. "Okay," she said at last. She promised herself she would not cry in this bright, sterile hallway. She would cry later, by herself in her car, for as long as she needed to. Right now, there were things that had to be handled, and she was the one to handle them. She had always been that person for Clara. She pulled out her phone and called a man named Benton Shaw. She had his business card in her wallet because Clara had given it to her 3 weeks earlier, with a casual air that was not casual at all. The counseling office was stark, with a small table, 4 chairs, and a window looking out at a brick wall. Janine half listened to the grief counselor, a gentle woman in a blue sweater who spoke in a careful, practiced voice. But the words were just noise. Janine could only stare at the brick wall and think about Clara's 7 houseplants. She knew them all, like the stubborn pothos in the kitchen Clara called Gerald, or the delicate fiddle leaf fig in the living room that was a constant source of worry. There was a tiny succulent garden on the bathroom windowsill and a pot of rosemary near the kitchen door. And in the nursery, next to the crib, sat a single small plant in a pale blue pot. Clara had bought it at a market, wanting something alive in the room for when the twins arrived. "Her plants," Janine said, cutting the counselor off. "Someone needs to water her plants." The woman jotted a note, murmuring that focusing on small tasks is a way to handle shock. But this was not shock. It was the sharp, cold clarity that comes right after. In that state, everything becomes simple, because it has to be. She picked up her phone to text Clara, but her fingers froze after 3 words. She looked at Clara's name on the screen and the last message from 2 days ago. It was a photo of the new nursery, with 2 cribs and the little blue pot on the sill. Clara's message was just 2 words. Almost ready, Janine placed the phone face down. She would not cry here. She excused herself, thanked the woman, and walked to the bathroom. She ran cold water over her wrists and looked at her own reflection. Then, she searched for Benton Shaw's number and made the call. Here was the secret no one at the hospital knew. 6 weeks ago, on a February afternoon, Clara Whitfield went to the law office of Benton Shaw. She sat down and said, "I need you to create a sealed document. It is not to be opened until after I die, or with my written permission. I have a complete list of its contents and the people who must be there when it is opened." Benton Shaw had practiced estate law for 30 years. He had worked with the grieving, the afraid, and the clever. But he had never had a client quite like Clara. She was 7 months pregnant, sitting perfectly calm with her hands folded in her lap. Her voice never wavered, and her directions were perfectly clear. She offered no tears or apologies. She never said things like, "This might sound odd," or "I am probably overthinking this." She just explained what she needed and waited for him to agree. For 4 months, she had been gathering everything for the document. She had even hired a private investigator, paying him from a savings account Edmund had long forgotten about. The investigator's report was thorough. It detailed 14 months of contact between Edmund and Veronica Hale, including dates, places, and photos. Clara had also discovered the money transfers. $2,300,000 moved in 3 payments from their joint account to a company she had never heard of. It took her 2 weeks to trace that company to its main beneficiary, a man named Thomas Hale, Veronica's father. Clara had known about the affair for 4 months and the money for 6 weeks. She told no one, waiting as she became 32, then 34, then 36 weeks pregnant. She had to bring her babies into the world first. They had to be safe and sound. Once they were born, she would handle everything else. She never planned on not being there to do it herself, but she had a plan for that too. This was the detail that changed the story. Clara Whitfield was not some unsuspecting victim. She was not a woman who needed saving. She was a woman who saw her reality with perfect focus and had prepared accordingly. And through it all, she went to her checkups, folded tiny clothes, and watered her 7 plants, because that is how she cared for those she loved. She had been building a fortress the entire time. In a third-floor supply closet, a nurse named Addie Carr cried for exactly 4.5 minutes. With 11 years of experience, she had a system for grief. Do it in private, get it all out, then get back to work. After washing her face, she returned to the nursery where the baby boy was stirring. She offered him her finger, and he latched on with a fierce, determined grip, like someone who had just arrived and planned on staying. As his tiny fingers squeezed hers, she thought, "You have no idea what your mother left for you. You cannot imagine what she built for you while she was building you." The boy's grip held firm. Next to him, his sister slept with her hands open, as if waiting for something. Addie stood between them for a long time. Down the hall, Ruth Whitfield arrived at 6:17 in the evening. She used a private entrance, looking immaculate in a dark coat, a woman who had been in charge for 50 years. She walked to the desks and asked for Janine Crawford. They sent her down the hall. Janine was standing right outside the counseling room as Ruth approached. Their eyes locked. Ruth Whitfield was 71 years old. For 34 years, she and her husband George had built a dynasty. She had survived financial crises, public scandals, his death, and the slow decay of a wealthy, dishonest family. She was a woman who never showed her emotions. But she showed them now. "Tell me," she said. And Janine explained everything. Ruth listened without a single interruption. When Janine was done, Ruth was silent for a moment. Then she asked, "The babies, both alive?" "A boy and a girl." Ruth shut her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, her face was hard, but it was also resolute. "I need to see my grandchildren," she said. Janine led her to the nursery window. Ruth stared at Oliver and Elise Whitfield in their incubators, standing perfectly still. Janine watched a new expression form on Ruth's face, one stripped of all its usual defenses, as if shock and understanding had arrived together. "I was not kind to her," Ruth said quietly, her gaze fixed on the babies. Janine said nothing. "For 6 years, I made her feel like an intruder. I was cruel in small ways, the kind of ways I told myself did not count." She paused. "My husband George told me I was wrong about her. He told me she noticed everything, but I was too proud to listen because she was so quiet." Ruth finally turned from the glass. "He was right." Janine just met her gaze. "I will do better for these children," Ruth stated. "That change begins right now." It was not an apology. It was a promise from a woman who knew she was in the final stage of her life and had one last chance to be the person she should have been all along. Janine believed her. Edmund Whitfield learned of his wife's death at 7:08 that evening. He had finally retrieved his phone from Veronica's front hall at 6:50. A feeling of simple unease had slowly turned into a terrible dread. He told Veronica he had to check his messages, and she did not argue. He walked to the entryway and turned his phone over. He saw 37 missed calls, 14 text messages, and 3 voicemails from an unknown number, which turned out to be the hospital's main line. The phone began to ring again, just as he was looking at the screen. It was his mother. He answered instantly. "Edmund." Her voice was hollow. In 44 years, he had heard his mother angry, sharp, and disappointed. He had never heard her sound like this, completely empty of all emotion, even her famous control. "Clara died at 5:53 this evening," she said. "The babies are both fine. You have a son and a daughter." He could not find any words to say. "I have been at Mercy Summit Hospital for over an hour," she continued. "I was the only member of the Whitfield family here for the birth of your children and the death of your wife." He heard her inhale sharply. "Where have you been, Edmund?" The question was an accusation. He started. "I know precisely where you were," she interrupted. "The hospital called your office. Philip called you. Janine Crawford called you 11 times. Your wife died while you were at that woman's house with your phone silenced." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a man with nothing left to say. "You need to get to the hospital," Ruth said. "Come and see your children." Then she ended the call. From the dining room entrance, Veronica had heard enough. She noticed his voice was flat when he answered, then grew heavy as the call continued. She knew the kind of terrible silence that followed. Edmund grabbed his jacket from a chair. He walked to the door without even looking at her. She just watched him go. The door shut, leaving her in the candlelit room with white flowers and an uneaten dinner for two. For a long time she stood perfectly still. Edmund's driver reached Mercy Summit Hospital in just 11 minutes. Edmund hurried through a private entrance and down the hall. He looked like a man who wanted to run, but knew it would be admitting his guilt. He was not ready to admit what he had done. He might never be. A nurse, Addie Carr, saw him coming. She was accustomed to seeing fathers arrive late. She had heard every excuse for why men miss their child's birth. She watched Edmund Whitfield rush by, made a silent judgment, and filed it away. She guided him to the nursery window. He stood motionless before the glass. Oliver slept with one tiny fist next to his cheek, the great effort of his birth now peaceful. Elise had both her palms open near her face, as if she were reaching for something. For 11 minutes, Edmund did not move. The ventilation hummed. A supply cart rolled past. Far down the hall, a person laughed. It was the sound of someone completely unaware of what had happened in surgery 2 hours earlier. It was someone having a much better night. Edmund stared at his children, and the terrible feeling that started back at the apartment finally washed over him. It was more than just guilt, though that was part of it. This feeling was much bigger. It was the shock of a man who believed his life was solid, only to discover in one night that it was not. He was still at the glass when Janine came to him. She had been preparing for this moment. She had practiced her words ever since leaving the doctor's office. She chose a quiet voice, knowing it carried more weight than yelling. Clara always said that the most powerful people are the ones who make you lean in to listen. She stood beside him at the window, not looking at him. Her eyes stayed on the twins. "She tried to call you 4 times before the surgery," Janine said softly. "4 different times, Edmund. I was with her for everyone." "I was," he began to say. "Do not try to make an excuse to me," she said. "I just want you to listen." She took a breath. "I know where you were. I know the building. I know the woman's name. I know because I drove there right after they told me Clara was gone. I had to do something. I stood on the street and just looked up at the building." Her voice was perfectly calm. "I saved her call history before I even knew why. 11 calls, all with timestamps. I have saved them and sent them to my email. That proof is not going anywhere." Edmund was completely frozen. "Those 2 babies," Janine continued, "are the only reason I am not ruining your life tonight. I need you to understand that. And I need you to think about every decision you make from now on." She finally turned and looked right at him. He met her eyes. "She deserved so much better than you," Janine said. "A whole lot better. And those children now deserve a better father than you have been. The question is whether you can be that man." Then she turned and walked away. She went down the hall, through the double doors, and out into the cold night. She stood in the dark parking lot and just took a deep breath. Then she took out her phone and called Benton Shaw. "She is gone," she said when he answered. "I need to know what we do next." Benton was quiet for a moment. "She left very specific instructions about the order of events," he said. "We will follow her plan perfectly. I will call you tomorrow morning. Just tell me one thing," Janine pleaded. "Tell me she protected them." There was another brief pause. "She protected them completely," Benton replied. "She thought of everything." Janine stood in the cold, looking up at the bright hospital. She imagined Clara, 7 months pregnant, taking a train to the city, walking to a law firm, and building a safe future for her children in the little time she had left. Janine remembered how Clara always did the right thing for everyone else. She just did not always do it for herself. She went back inside the hospital. Edmund was still at the nursery window, exactly where she had left him. In another part of the hospital, Ruth Whitfield sat in the chapel. It was a small, plain room with neat rows of chairs and soft lighting. Ruth was not praying in the usual way. She had never been a religious person. But she started speaking into the empty room, and it felt like the same thing. She spoke about Clara. She recalled a Christmas when Clarice had secretly improved Ruth's gravy, and Ruth never even thanked her. She remembered a time when Clarice noticed the gardener had trimmed a hedge poorly. Clara gently spoke to him about it herself, solving the problem quietly. She spoke about how Clara would look at Edmund when he wasn't looking. It was not anger, but a patient understanding, as if she saw his true character and was deciding each day if it was enough. Ruth whispered into the silence, "I should have seen her that way. I should have tried to really see her." The room offered no answer. Ruth sat for a little longer. Then she stood, straightened her coat, and went to wait by the nursery for the morning to come. The family lawyer arrived at the Whitfield mansion on a Tuesday, 10 days after Clara died. A formal letter had been mailed the week before, listing all who were required to attend. Benton Shaw did not call ahead, and he permitted no changes to the list. Edmund sat at the head of the great dining table in the east wing. He had not slept properly in 10 days. His tiredness came from the heavy weight of his actions. To his left sat Ruth. She had come from the old family home, and would return there that night. She waited quietly with her hands folded, her face calm. His brother, Dale Whitfield, was across from him. At 47, he had a softer jawline. He carried an easy confidence, built from years of positioning himself as the more reliable brother. His wife Greta sat beside him. She was still, her hands clasped, her eyes carefully watching the room. At the far end of the table was Janine Crawford. The letter had insisted on her attendance. Dale had seen her name on the list, but said nothing, though his expression had flickered for just a moment. Benton Shaw placed a sealed envelope on the table. It was made from thick, cream-colored paper. A small wax seal with Clara S. initial was on the back, a tiny detail that carried great meaning. Dale reached for the letter. Benton put his own hand firmly on the table. "That is not for you, Dale." Dale drew his hand back. Benton used a letter opener to carefully break the seal, moving slowly, as if he knew this was a historic moment. He unfolded the papers inside. He looked at each person in the room. "Clara Whitfield wrote this on the 4th of February," he said. "She was 29. I was her witness, and I can say she was of sound mind. I will now read the entire document." He began to read, and the room became absolutely silent. First, he read the timeline. It listed 14 months of secret meetings between Edmund Whitfield and Veronica Hale. Every date and location was documented. The private investigator S report was included as evidence. Next, he read about the money. 3 large payments were made over 6 months. $2,300,000 were moved from a family account into another company. The true owner of that company was Thomas Hale. Greta S. hands, which were resting on the table, did not move an inch. Dale looked at Edmund. Edmund just watched Benton, his face showing that he was ready for his fate. Benton then read the final section. It was Clara's formal request that a judge decide the custody of Oliver and Elise, because of Edmund's behavior during her pregnancy. She had named 2 people to be guardians of her children's future: Janine Crawford and Ruth Whitfield. Benton placed the papers on the table. The silence in the room was heavy. Dale was the first to speak. He used words like "naturally" and "the family." "We must all be sensible," Dale said. "I am sure Edmund wants what is best for the children." Ruth interrupted him. "Be quiet, Dale." He stopped talking at once. Edmund did not say a word. He just sat with his hands on the table, staring at a spot on the wall behind Benton. "Is there anything false in this document?" Benton asked him plainly. Edmund took a moment to think. "No," he finally conceded. Benton stacked the papers together. "Then we'll follow Clara's instructions." His expression was calm and professional, the face of a man simply executing his client's last requests, not passing judgment. "She truly covered every detail." "Yes, she certainly did," Ruth chimed in. She stood up and buttoned her coat. For 10 days, she had rehearsed the look she was now giving Edmund. It was not a performance. It was a mother finally seeing her son for exactly who he was. "I will be waiting at the house," she informed him. "Come when you're ready." And with that, she left. Greta stood to go with Dale, who was already making for the door like he was late for something important. But Greta hesitated at the threshold. She looked back at Janine. A silent message, a moment of pure understanding, passed between them. They were women whose lives were shaped by the decisions of the men around them. In that instant, they both recognized the same truth. Greta gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Janine nodded back. By evening, the news had spread through the financial community. The affair was not the real scandal. For a family of their wealth, that was hardly surprising. The scandal was about the money. $2,300,000. The Shell Corporation, and the fact that Thomas Hale was listed as its owner. The question everyone was asking was whether the CEO of Whitfield Industries diverted family funds to his mistress's father while his own wife was pregnant. Now that was a real story. The board of directors called an emergency conference call. Dale discreetly phoned 3 board members. He began every conversation the same way. Of course, I support my brother. But he would always conclude by insisting that the company itself had to be protected. At 6 o'clock that evening, Veronica saw the story on her news app. She was sitting in her penthouse apartment. The white flowers in the vase were beginning to brown at the edges. Her father called at 6:15. Thomas Hale's voice was steady and controlled, like someone calmly recalculating his next move. He was careful not to say anything that could be held against him. He just mentioned that things were becoming complicated, that they had to proceed with caution, and that their window to act was closing. You need to get this under control, he warned her, before it controls you. Veronica looked at the wilting flowers. She was a master of control. She had learned early in life that being pleasant did not lead to success. She had skillfully managed people and situations that would have broken anyone else. She had never failed, and she was not about to start now. Her mind shifted to the newborn twins. She began to scheme about how to make herself essential to them. She could not be their stepmother just yet, but she could become a stable presence in their lives, a comfort to Edmund while his world unraveled. She picked up her phone to summon a car. She knew exactly what she had to do. She was never without a plan. I can still come out on top, she told herself. She was right about having a plan, but she was wrong about winning. She arrived at the Whitfield mansion 7 days later. She wore a simple, elegant gray outfit, a color that hinted at mourning without being overly dramatic, which was precisely the impression she wanted to create. She had given up wearing red 4 days after Clara's death. She understood that appearance was the only thing that mattered. Every choice she made was part of the image she built. She brought 2 cashmere baby blankets in a soft yellow, a neutral color, from a boutique that used fancy tissue paper. She also carried a card with a personal, handwritten note. Her penmanship was flawless, perfected over many years. The housekeeper, Margaret, who had served the family for 17 years and held a strong, private dislike for Veronica, opened the door. She couldn't refuse a visitor, especially since Edmund was waiting for her. Edmund saw her in the library. Veronica strategically stood in the center of the room, instead of taking a seat. It was a calculated choice to draw attention without appearing aggressive. The expression she wore was one she had practiced all the way there. It was a careful blend of concern, warmth, and quiet sorrow. "I don't want to make things more difficult," she began in a soft voice. "I just had to come see for myself that you were okay." Edmund just looked at her. He was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with his body, and everything to do with his spirit. "The babies need consistency," she continued. "They need to be surrounded by loving people. I want to be one of those people." "I am not trying to make your life more complicated," she assured him. "I am just someone who cares about you, and that means I care about them." She set the cashmere blankets on a small table. "I know the legal issues are a mess," she said. "I'm aware of what the document contains. You don't owe me any explanations. Just let me help. That's all I'm asking." Her delivery was flawless. Right outside the library, a nurse named Addie Carr walked by with clean linens for the nursery. Janine had hired her as a private nurse for the twins for their first 2 weeks, arranging it through the doctor's office. Janine had handled it while Edmund was still in shock, unable to run the household. Addie passed the library without slowing down. She could hear Veronica's voice using words like stability and loathing. She kept walking without a second glance. She carried the sheets into the nursery and put them in the closet. She lingered for a moment in the peaceful green room. A small blue pot with a healthy plant sat on the windowsill. Addie had watered it that morning, like she did every day. Then she pulled out her phone. She had Janine's number. She had saved it at the hospital, sensing it might be important one day, though she wasn't sure why. Her fingers quickly typed a short message. "That woman from the news is here. She is in the library with Edmund. I thought you should know." She sent it and put the phone away. She gently lifted Oliver from his crib, where he was gazing at the ceiling like a tiny, serious professor. Then she settled into the rocking chair with him. The chair was covered in a soft, pale cream fabric. Clara had found it at an estate sale and had spent a whole Saturday restoring it. Swatches of fabric had covered the kitchen table as music played on the radio. Margaret had told Addie that story. In her 17 years with the family, she had never seen anyone else do something so personal. Oliver gazed up at her. She spoke in a quiet voice, as if the room itself could hold her words, even if the baby could not. Your mother sat right here in this chair and dreamed about you long before you arrived. She pictured this very room that you would one day come home to. Oliver made a little noise, not quite a happy gurgle, but close. Back in the library, Veronica's visit was coming to a close. She had said all the things she had rehearsed. The gifts were on the table. She had made her case with the precision of a well-practiced speech. But as she watched Edmund's face, she saw something that made her uneasy. Edmund said, "I'm grateful you came by." She recognized that tone immediately. She had heard it from other men. It was the sound of polite dismissal, like a door being gently but firmly closed. She knew it well, so she adjusted her expression and just waited. Benton is submitting the documents this week, Edmund explained, for the family court to review. It will all be very formal. I see, she replied. I believe it would be best, he said, choosing his words with a new and strange carefulness, if you stayed out of that process. If you could just give us some room for a while. A period of quiet. Veronica studied him. She noticed the tension in his jaw and how still his hands were. He was looking out the window instead of at her. She wasn't sure if he was being a coward or trying to be kind. Of course, she said. Her voice was full of warmth and understanding, a perfect mask for her real feelings. She left the blankets lying on the table. She walked right out of the house. From the back seat of the car, she watched the large estate gates swing shut in the rearview mirror. She stared until they vanished from sight. Her father's call came 20 minutes later. She ignored it. She watched the city lights streak past her window. She thought, this isn't over. I haven't been defeated. I've just been delayed. I'll find another angle, I'll be patient, and my chance will come. She believed it with every fiber of her being. She was completely wrong, but she would not realize that until the memorial service. Ruth Whitfield was the one to put the kettle on. Benton Shaw came to the Whitfield estate at 10 o'clock in the morning. Ruth had already placed 2 cups on the table in the cozy sitting room off the kitchen. None of the household staff was around. Benton understood the meaning of this tea service. He had known Ruth Whitfield for 26 years. When she prepared the tea herself, the conversation was going to be private. It meant that here she was not his client. He accepted his cup and sat down across from her. Tell me what Clara arranged for the twins, Ruth said directly. Benton responded, Ruth, you know there are legal restrictions on what I can disclose outside of official proceedings. Benton, she said, I was there at the hospital. I held those babies the night they were born when their father was nowhere to be found. I stayed outside that nursery until 4 in the morning because a Whitfield had to be there for them. Now, you will tell me what that young woman left for her children. Sos, he told her everything. The explanation lasted 45 minutes. Ruth listened without saying a word. She only posed 2 questions, which were essentially the same question asked in different ways. Was Clara trying to shield the children from Edmund, or was she protecting them from anyone who would prioritize the family fortune over the children's welfare? Benton considered it for a moment. From anyone, he answered. Her wording was precise. She never portrayed Edmund as a villain. She described him as a man who would need guidance to become the father his children deserved. She was trying to protect, not punish. There is a world of difference. Ruth paused. She handled it the right way, she said. Yes, she certainly did. It was not done from a place of anger. No. Both times we talked, she was completely calm. But she was not cold. She was simply composed. Ruth set down her teacup. She looked out at George's garden, kept just as he had designed it. The gardener followed his plan to the letter, on Ruth's instructions. I was not kind to her, Ruth said. Benton remained quiet. This was not his place to comment. This was not a conversation that required his input. I once told my husband she was nice, but had no depth. George said I had her all wrong. He believed she was the most perceptive person we had ever met. He thought I only said that because it was easier than truly seeing her. She breathed in deeply. And he was right. She noticed everything, but she never drew attention to it. She would simply fix things quietly, never asking for thanks. She paused. For years I found that trait aggravating, she confessed. George was the same way, and I missed him terribly. When I saw it in her, it just reminded me of my loss, and I treated her badly for it. That is the worst way to be cruel, when it has nothing to do with the person you are hurting. The clock in the kitchen kept a steady rhythm. The wind sighed through George's hedges outside. I want to officially participate in the guardianship hearing, Ruth announced. On Clara's side. Supporting what she wanted, not what Edmund wants. That will put him in a very difficult legal spot, Benton noted. Yes, it will. He could take it as a betrayal. What he did to her while she was pregnant. Ruth countered that was the real betrayal. I am just trying to repair something that never should have been damaged. She met Benton's gaze without flinching. I am 71 years old. I do not have time to beat around the bush anymore. I need to handle this correctly, while I still have the chance. Benton observed her for a moment. I am going to need a written statement from you, he said. Nothing legalistic. Clara wrote a personal letter. The judge will find it helpful to hear a similar perspective. I can certainly do that, Ruth replied. When Benton left, Ruth walked to the small den off the kitchen. George's reading chair was still there. She had never moved it or reupholstered it. The fabric on the left arm was thin, from where George held his books in his right hand. She settled into the chair. She reached for the wedding photograph on the small side table. It showed Edmund and Clara. Their wedding was a small affair, not at all what Ruth expected for a Whitfield. But looking at it now, she saw a detail she had overlooked for years. Clara was caught in a moment of pure laughter, her head thrown back. It looked like someone told an inappropriate joke at just the wrong moment. This was not a polite chuckle. It was a joyful laugh that illuminated her face. In the background, Ruth herself was visible. Her face had an expression that plainly said, I do not get you. Ruth studied her own image as she stared at Clara. She knew she should have made more of an effort. She should have paid better attention. She set the picture frame down carefully. Her thoughts turned to Oliver, his little fist resting against his cheek. She pictured Elise, with her hands open as if to greet the world. She considered what kind of grandmother she would become, starting this very moment. She would start from scratch, building a relationship based on truth. She thought to herself, those babies do not deserve to carry our burdens. I can give them that one gift. A chance to be better than we were. Later that evening, Edmund came to the main house. He let himself in with his old key through the side door that was always tight in winter. Ruth was in the kitchen, where a fresh pot of tea and 2 cups were set out. He took a seat, warming his hands around the teacup. This afternoon I blocked her number, he stated. Veronica's. Ruth simply watched her son. It is not nearly enough, he added. I am aware of that. No, Ruth confirmed. It is not. But it is a beginning. The first step on a very long path. They sat in silence in the familiar kitchen, 2 people finally finding honesty again. The wind whispered through George's garden, making a sound like things finding their proper place. Edmund looked down into his tea. She knew, he said quietly, about Veronica and the money. She knew everything. Ruth remained silent. She knew and never confronted me. She just carried on, handling everything, preparing the nursery, and going to her doctor visits. He stopped talking, lost in thought for a moment. I thought I understood her completely. It was easy to label her as simple, instead of really looking at her. He put his cup down on the table. She was the most complicated person I have ever met, he said. I was just too lazy to actually see, Ruth observed her son. She did not offer agreement or sympathy. Instead, she asked, so what is your plan now? He did not answer for a long time. I will do whatever Benton needs, he finally answered. Whatever is required for the children and the court. Ruth nodded once. That is your starting point, she told him. The memorial service for Clara Whitfield was held on a Thursday, 3 weeks after her death. Her family came in from Ohio for the service. Her parents, Barbara and Dawn, were in attendance. Her sister, Carol, was there too. She was a quiet woman who looked like Clara, but had a different sort of stillness. A pair of cousins lingered by the door, keeping to themselves. They were normal people, wearing their nicest clothes. They looked around the magnificent estate, trying not to seem out of place. They understood they were in a world unlike theirs, and held themselves with a gentle grace. Barbara, Claire's mother, stood for a long time in front of a framed photo in the entrance hall. The picture had been taken when Clara was 6 months along. In the photo, Clara was in the pale green nursery. Her hand was on her stomach as she looked at something out of view. It was an unposed photograph that caught a private moment. Her thoughts at that time gave her a look of deep, calm peace. Barbara looked at the picture for so long that Carol came and took her hand wordlessly. Addie Carr entered quietly and stood against a wall. She was there as part of a personal custom for her former patients. She stayed out of the way. She did not think anyone would recognize her. She just wanted to pay her respects from the side of the room. Janine, on the other hand, moved through the room with purpose. She made her way to Clara's family to talk with them. She got Barbara some water and helped her find a chair. She watched over everyone in the room carefully. At 11:15, Veronica Hale arrived. She was wearing a gray dress with a silver pin at the neck. She had researched what to wear for such an occasion and was dressed perfectly. She greeted the people she knew with a handshake. She offered sympathy with carefully chosen words. She moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a lifelong performer. After a while, the guests moved into the East drawing room. Someone decided it was a good idea to serve champagne. In hindsight, that one choice altered the path of everything that followed. Veronica was in the East drawing room with Greta and 2 of Edmund's business associates with their wives. Glasses of champagne were passed around. The talk turned to pleasant memories, as it usually does at these events. People spoke of her legacy, the wonderful children, and how proud Clara would have been. One of the wives commented on the tragedy of the twins growing up without their mother. "Those poor babies," she said. "They will have no memory of her at all." At that moment, Veronica, who had been perfectly composed for 3 weeks, who had managed every detail since Edmund left, felt something snap inside her. After 14 months of exhausting, flawless performance, a crack finally appeared. One small part of her control gave way. "Well," she began, her tone quiet and cutting. It was the voice she used with people she considered peers, when she dropped her polite facade. It was a tone that suggested, "We can all be honest here, let us be real." At least they will not have to see her cry every time Edmund was late from work. The words came out in a hurry. She ended with a brief, sharp laugh. It was the sound of someone releasing pressure that had built up for too long. It was the sound of a person who, for 3 reckless seconds, forgot her location and her audience. The silence that followed was not polite. It was heavy and deliberate, from people who heard every word. They were now deciding what to do. Greta set her champagne glass on a table with a soft click. She excused herself from the group, disappearing the way she had for 20 years. She had mastered how to leave a room without anyone noticing. It was a skill learned from being ignored by this family for 2 decades. They brought her to meetings only to be a silent witness. She was treated like furniture. She knew their secrets and was expected to keep them. She then walked across the big hall. She saw Janine with Addie Carr near the tea station. "I have to tell you what I just heard," Greta said. Janine's expression showed she knew this was serious. "I need you to say it again," Janine answered. Into this, she held up her phone, the voice recorder already on. Greta looked at the phone. She thought about 20 years of being invisible in rooms full of people. She recalled Dale's condescending remarks to the board. She remembered being Dale's required witness at the estate meeting, and how she memorized every detail she saw and heard. That was her special talent. Holding on to information was her only power, until now. She spoke into the phone with a clear voice. She repeated Veronica's words perfectly, including the tone and that little cruel laugh. Janine saved the recording. She looked at Greta. "Thank you," she said. Greta simply said, "Make sure you use it." She then turned and went back to the drawing room and picked up her champagne glass. She stood next to Dale and smiled at his story. Back at the tea table, Janine and Addie stood together. "I have something that could help," Addie said softly. From the night Clara was taken to the hospital, she told Janine about the hospital's automatic call system. 11 calls were made to Edmund in 3 hours, all logged by the hospital. Each call had a timestamp, creating an official record separate from Janine's phone. "Can we access that?" Janine asked. "It is a hospital administrative record," Addie said carefully. "A hospital administrator with the right legal reason could get it." "Benton Shaw will know how," Janine agreed. They stood there at the tea table, at a memorial for a woman they loved. They were surrounded by flowers and the quiet sounds of conversation and clinking teacups. And in that quiet moment, they were the most powerful people in the room. Neither of them looked around. Benton Shaw quietly left the reception at 2:30 to take a call. He was gone for only 3 minutes. He came back through a side entrance and looked around the room for Ruth. He gave her one quick, firm nod. Ruth put her teacup down. She excused herself from her chat with Clara's family, touching Barbara's arm gently as she walked to Benton by the door. He spoke in a low voice, very close to her. "The court date is confirmed," he said. "Judge Christine Waverly. 3 weeks from Tuesday." Ruth just looked at him. "Good," she replied. She then walked back into the reception. Veronica left an hour later. She had recovered her calm 30 seconds after her comment, smoothing things over with a charming remark and moving the conversation on, staying in perfect control all day. She did not know about Greta's phone. She had no idea about the hospital's call records. She did not know that a court date was already set. She left the memorial service thinking her morning had gone perfectly. This was a very dangerous kind of mistake, the kind you cannot see because you are inside it. Family court began on a Tuesday morning in a building that smelled like old coffee and dusty carpet. The courtroom walls were a dull beige. The fluorescent lights overhead made a low, humming sound. The chairs were built for durability, not for comfort. Judge Christine Waverly had handled cases like this for 22 years. She was 60 years old, with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She had a special quality that the best judges have. She was never impressed by the things that usually impress people. She did not care about money, family influence, fancy suits, or how many lawyers a person had. She was, however, always impressed by good preparation. She had already read all the documents filed for the case. She had read them twice, making notes into margins with a red pen. Edmund sat at the main table with his lawyer. He looked like he had aged 5 years in only 3 weeks, which was close to the truth. Ruth sat to his left. She insisted on a seat at the table, not in the audience, and Benton had arranged it. Janine sat in the second row of the public gallery. She had picked her outfit very carefully. She kept her hands still in her lap. Dale was also in the gallery. He was there just to watch, the only thing he could do. He had the look of someone pretending to be a simple observer while his mind was racing. Greta sat 3 seats away from Dale. This was wider space than they normally kept between them in public. Benton Shaw started his presentation. He submitted the sealed document. He presented the detective's report and photographs. He showed the financial statements with the money transfers. He proved the shell company existed and showed who really owned it. Judge Waverly looked at each document, her expression impossible to read. She asked Benton 2 questions, which he answered perfectly. Then he said, "Your Honor, I have an audio recording to submit as evidence." Greta's clear voice came through the speakers, explaining the context. Then came Veronica's voice, her words followed by that short, dry laugh. The courtroom was completely silent when the recording finished. Judge Waverly made a note and looked at the gallery. Benton then said, "Your Honor, I have one more document." It was a letter from Claire Whitfield, written for this very situation. Benton explained Claire wrote it at the same time as the sealed document. He presented the letter, confirmed it was real, and asked permission to read it aloud. "You may proceed," Judge Waverly allowed. As he read, the room fell silent. The first thing people noticed was that Claire's words had no anger. Her writing was free of any bitterness, which made it stronger than rage. Anger is easy to dismiss. This was not anger, it was just the truth. She wrote about her marriage honestly, but not unkindly. She explained why she stayed and why she chose to prepare instead of leave. She described Edmund as a man who could be better than he was. She was clear that she did not want him kept from his children. She asked the court to ensure other people helped protect their future. She chose Janine Crawford, writing about her unconditional love and help. Janine, she wrote, understood the children's needs because she always understood what Claire needed. She also chose Ruth Whitfield. She wrote about Ruth with a unique kindness, like someone who chooses to understand a person who wronged them. Claire wrote that Ruth knew right from wrong and would do what was right when it mattered most. She believed the children would finally be that important thing. She was right. Benton placed the letter down. Judge Waverly took her glasses off, cleaned them, then put them back on. She looked at the documents for a long time. "I would like to call Dr. Patricia Saw," she said. Dr. Saw entered from the hallway, looking calm and professional in the serious courtroom. She took the witness stand and listed her qualifications. In a clear medical voice, she answered questions about the birth. She described the timing, the complications, the emergency surgery, the twins' survival, and their mother's death at 5:53 that afternoon. She spoke with complete confidence. She had rehearsed this for 3 weeks. She could now say it all with a steady voice and a calm face. Then Judge Waverly looked straight at her. "Dr. Saw," she said, "in your professional medical judgment, are Oliver and Elise Whitfield the biological children of Edmund James Whitfield?" "Yes, Your Honor," Dr. Saw said. She said it as a simple fact, like everything else she had said. DNA was confirmed during standard hospital procedures. "Both children are the biological children of Edmund James Whitfield," she finished. "Their birth certificates are on file with the state, which makes them his legal heirs." A deep silence fell over the courtroom. Edmund just stared at the table. Dale Whitfield sat very still in the gallery. Greta, sitting just a few seats away, saw that his hands were trembling slightly. Veronica was not in court. She was not considered family, so she could not be there. She was in her penthouse apartment, checking her phone for updates from a reporter she knew. A message came at 11:43. It said the Whitfield twins were confirmed as biological heirs. She placed her phone screen down. The glass flower bowl was clean and stored away. The candle holders were in a drawer she hadn't touched for 2 weeks. She sat in the quiet penthouse, looking at the city that never changed. The buildings and streets and far-off lights offered no reply. In the courtroom, Judge Waverly gave her decision. Edmund and Ruth Whitfield would share guardianship, with a review each quarter. Janine Crawford was appointed the children's advocate. All financial matters were sent to a board for review. Clara S. sealed letter was entered into the official court record. Judge Waverly looked right at Edmund. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I have read your late wife's letter. She did not ask me to punish you. She asked me to protect your children. And I will. I suggest you think about whether your future actions will respect her wish." Edmund answered quietly, "Yes, Your Honor." When the hearing ended, Janine left through a side door to the parking garage, with her hands in her pockets and collar up against the chill. In her pocket, her hand fidgeted with the 3 keys from the hospital. 1 key was for the front door, 1 for the garden gate, and the last one for the cellar. She heard footsteps behind her and turned around. It was Benton Shaw walking to his car. He stopped when he saw her. "She wanted you to have this," he explained. After the hearing, but only if the judge ruled her way. He reached into his briefcase and took out a small envelope. Her name was written on it in Clara's flowing script, as if the letters were leaning forward. Janine held the envelope with both of her hands. "She was very specific," Benton said. "Only after, I know." "That sounds just like Clara," Janine said with a small smile. She put it in her pocket next to the 3 keys and drove home. The judge's official ruling arrived that Friday. A courier delivered it in a plain, simple envelope. Edmund signed for it at the door. He paused for a moment before opening it. He read the words twice: shared guardianship, Ruth with a formal role, Janine as the advocate, and finances under investigation. It was what the judge said in court, but now it was on paper. It was now final and real. He set the documents on a table and walked to the nursery. Oliver was awake in his crib, staring at the ceiling. Elise was sound asleep, with a tiny fist tucked under her chin. He looked at the green walls, the 2 cribs, the rocking chair, and the healthy plant on the windowsill, which he had started watering 3 days ago. He had not meant to. He just saw that the soil was dry and he went to get water. It was the first truly domestic thing he had done in that house. He lifted Oliver from the crib and sat in the rocking chair. Oliver looked up at him with the intense, wise gaze of a newborn, not yet knowing to look away. Edmund held his son in the chair that Clara had picked out, in a silence that he no longer tried to fight. This was not about being forgiven. The story could not give him that. If forgiveness ever arrived, it would be far beyond this moment. What he did have was this room his wife had made for her children. He had a chair she had fixed with her own 2 hands. A plan she chose because living things make a home feel loved. He had a path to follow, and it was the only one he could take. It was a place to start. The next day, Ruth and Janine made a plan to meet in the nursery. Ruth arrived there first. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes taking in the room. It was her first time back since that terrible night when she stood on this spot and looked at 2 empty cribs, saying nothing at all. She went to Elisa's crib and gently picked up the baby. After 71 years of holding babies, she knew the simple act was a promise. Elise made a soft sound of simple contentment. Janine entered a few moments later. She walked to Oliver's crib and picked him up, and he watched her face with a curious look. The 2 women stood there quietly. Ruth looked down at Elise and whispered, "She chose good people." Janine nodded. "She always did. She just never learned how to choose herself first," Janine said softly. Ruth considered that, letting the words sink in. She wanted to understand what they truly meant. "We can teach them to choose themselves, elves," Ruth said with new purpose. "We will," Janine promised. They stood there together as the afternoon sun warmed the pale green walls. The sky outside was turning that special blue-gray of the early spring. It is a color that seems cold but holds a secret warmth inside. That evening, Janine sat at her table with a cup of tea she had yet to drink. From her coat pocket, she took out the small envelope she had kept since she left the courthouse. Clara's round, forward-leaning script was on the envelope. Janine opened it carefully, as if it were something very fragile. The letter inside was a little more than a page long. Clara's handwriting seemed to change its pace. Sometimes it was slow and careful. Other times it was rushed, as if the thoughts were pouring out. Janine began to read from the top. Clara wrote of her dreams for the children. She explained how she hoped Ruth and Janine would guide them together, as partners, not as rivals. She made a list of things she wanted the twins to know when they were old enough. Janine's jaw was tight as she read the first few paragraphs. Her eyes were dry and she was focused. But when she reached the last section, she froze. She read it once, and then she read it again. A sudden wet laugh escaped her throat. It was the sound of getting a surprise gift you desperately needed. It was the laugh of someone feeling truly understood by a friend who always saw her. It was one last, perfect piece of that friendship. It was a laugh of pure recognition, and a love so special she knew she would miss it every day for the rest of her life. She put the letter down on the table, then picked it right back up. She read the final part one more time. Clara's last words were not about the money, the twins, or the legal case. All of that was handled. She had dealt with the official business in the sealed court document. What Clara wrote to Janine was about a promise. It was a promise 2 20-year-olds had made one autumn in a tiny apartment. They had cheap wine, great pasta, and a very clear idea of their future. They had seen a photograph in a magazine of the Irish coast, a green, ancient cliff overlooking the Atlantic. The pictures made you feel small in the best possible way. With a silly kind of seriousness, they promised to go there together someday. They would stand on that cliff, feel the wind on their skin, and just look at the ocean. 20 years had passed. Life became complicated, as it always does. The trip turned into a one-day kind of plan. One day really meant when things are less busy, but things never became less busy. Janine, Clara had written, "For 20 years, you have told me you are waiting for me so we can go to that cliff. You have waited with a patience and a loyalty that is just so you. So I am telling you now, from wherever I might be, please stop waiting. Go and stand on that cliff. Feel the wind. Look at the ocean. It is so huge, and it was here long before we were, and it will be there long after we are gone. Standing there will show you the real size of your worries and your dreams. When you are there, tell me what you see. Just speak it out loud. I will hear you. You know I will. I always heard you. You always made certain I heard you when it was important. Go, Janine. The cliff is not going anywhere. But you, my dear friend, have waited long enough." Janine folded the letter and just held it for a moment. She placed it on the table. Then she opened her laptop computer and typed, "Flights to Dublin, Ireland." She did a search for West Coast Ireland, Atlantic cliffs. She looked up the cliffs of Moher, her screen filled with pictures of giant, ancient green cliffs. You could almost feel the wind just from the photos, seeing it in the bent grass and the rough sea. The ocean was gray and silver and went on forever. She looked at the photos. She imagined Clara, 7 months pregnant, going downtown by herself to meet with a lawyer. She saw her with a sealed envelope and firm instructions, a woman who knew that love is something you do. She knew that real love means preparing for a future you will not see. She thought of Oliver and his watchful eyes. She saw Elise with her little fist tucked beneath her chin. She thought of Ruth, who was learning at 71 that it is never too late to start over. She remembered Addie Carr, who walked by Clara's hospital bed so she would not be by herself. She thought of Greta, who finally spoke her truth, deciding she was worth more. And she thought of Clara, who had softly and completely changed her own life. Clara was like the slow, constant weather that can change the shape of a stone over many years. Right now, in a house very much like this one, there is a woman who is awake. The time is 3 in the morning. She is sitting in the dark, looking at her phone. She is looking at calls and texts that do not give her the words she needs to hear. She continues to check, as if the answer might somehow be different. She keeps checking her phone again and again. She already knows the truth. She has known it for some time, in the same way that Clara knew. It was not one large event, but 1,000 tiny moments. A dinner that finished much too early. A phone call that was never made. She stopped asking the question because she could not handle the answer. She knows what she has to do. The only thing left to ask is if she is ready. Is she ready to finally put the phone down? Is she ready to stop waiting for a call that is not coming and start walking toward her own life? Clara Whitfield made that exact choice. At 37 weeks pregnant, lying in a cold hospital room, she made it. She held her best friend's hand, and she put her trust in her doctor. She made her decision with all the love and the time she had left for the people she cared about most. That was her real legacy. It was not the inheritance or the legal documents, although those things were helpful. Her real gift was the lesson. Love is about being prepared. Building a safe future for the people you leave behind is not a second-best choice. It is the most powerful thing a person can do. It is what remains when all else is gone. Clara saw what was coming and she prepared for it. She built something that would last. Janine Crawford bought her plane ticket to Ireland that Thursday night in early April. She chose a window seat for the flight. She put Clara's letter in a special pocket inside her bag, the one closest to her heart. She arrived in Dublin on a Friday morning. The sky was a gentle Irish gray. It was not a color of sadness but of quiet hope. Her journey involved a train, a bus, and a final walk of half a mile. The air smelled of recent rain, fresh grass, and the salty ocean. 11 days after the court took everything, she found herself on the cliff's edge. The great Atlantic moved below, a silver giant that knew nothing of her pain. She understood this feeling of smallness was the gift Clara wanted her to have. A powerful wind swept up the cliff, as if it had crossed the world just to greet her. She simply stood, letting it press against her while she watched the endless water. Then she spoke to the open air, her voice a whisper. "Clara, it is enormous. I have never seen anything so vast in my entire life. The grass is so vibrant, and the wind is so cold. There was only the horizon stretching out forever." She then added, "You were right. This is the perfect scale. It is the right size for everything." She stood there for a long time, but her thoughts drifted back to the light green nursery at the Whitfield estate. In her mind, Oliver and Elise slept peacefully in their cribs, covered in morning sunlight. A little blue ceramic pot rested on the windowsill, soaking in the light. It leaned toward the sun, just as all life does. It was a quiet, strong reminder to always move toward warmth, to find it, and to grow toward your needs without a second thought. Someone had remembered to give that little plant water. Someone always would. And one last thought for you. Our team poured our hearts into this story to share important lessons that we hope you remember. All of the characters and events you heard are fictional and created for you to enjoy. If anything seems like a real person or a true story, it is only by chance. We are so happy you are here with us. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. That truly means the world to us.